The kitchen timer was beeping when I walked through the front door that Tuesday evening, my laptop bag heavy on my shoulder and exhaustion weighing down every step. Derek's voice drifted from the kitchen, unusually cheerful as he called out his greeting. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of the warmth that used to greet me every night when we were newlyweds. 6 years of marriage had worn away many of those small gestures, so his effort to cook dinner felt like a pleasant surprise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I dropped my bag by the stairs and headed toward the kitchen, loosening my blazer as I walked. Derek stood at the stove, his back to me, stirring something in a large pot. The scene looked perfectly domestic, exactly like the life I thought we'd built together in our 2-story colonial on Maple Street. Steam rose from the pot, and Derek hummed softly under his breath, completely absorbed in his cooking. That's when I saw it. Derek reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small plastic vial, no bigger than my thumb. With practiced movements, he twisted off the cap and tapped something into the pot. The motion was so casual, so routine, that it took my brain several seconds to process what I was witnessing. He stirred the contents once more, replaced the cap on the vial, and slipped it back into his pocket like he'd done this 1,000 times before. My blood turned to ice. Every instinct screamed that what I'd just witnessed was wrong, deeply wrong, but my mind struggled to make sense of it. Derek, my husband of 6 years, the man who brought me coffee in bed on weekends and remembered my favorite flowers, had just added something from a hidden vial to our dinner. Something he clearly didn't want me to know about. I pressed myself against the doorframe, heart hammering so loudly I was certain he'd hear it. Derek continued stirring, completely unaware of my presence. He tasted the food with a clean spoon, nodded with satisfaction, and began setting the table for 2. The normalcy of his movements made the whole scene feel surreal, like I was watching a stranger wearing my husband's face. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to back away quietly. I needed time to think, to process what I'd seen before confronting him. In the safety of the living room, I sank onto the couch and tried to steady my breathing. Questions flooded my mind faster than I could process them. How long had this been going on? What was he putting in my food? Why would my own husband want to drug me? The last question hit me like a physical blow. Drug me. That's what this was, wasn't it? There was no innocent explanation for secretly adding substances to food. The realization made my stomach churn, and suddenly every recent meal we'd shared took on a sinister quality. Every time I'd felt unusually tired after dinner, every morning I'd woken up groggy despite getting enough sleep, every moment of brain fog I'd attributed to work stress, all of it suddenly had a potential explanation that terrified me. Derek's voice calling from the kitchen jolted me back to the present. "Amanda, dinner's ready. I made that pasta dish you love." The pasta dish I love. The irony was bitter. I stood on shaky legs and walked back to the kitchen, my mind racing. Derek had already served 2 plates, and he smiled warmly as I entered. He looked exactly like the man I'd married, the man I'd trusted with my heart, my future, my life. Yet I'd just watched him contaminate my food with an unknown substance. "You look tired, honey," he said, pulling out my chair with the kind of gentlemanly gesture that had first attracted me to him. "Long day at the agency?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. The plate in front of me looked delicious, creamy pasta, with herbs and chicken, exactly the kind of comfort food I usually craved after a difficult day. Now it looked like a weapon. Derek sat across from me and began eating with obvious enjoyment. "I tried a new recipe I found online," he said between bites. "Added some special seasonings I picked up at that gourmet store downtown. What do you think?" Special seasonings. My hands trembled as I picked up my fork. He was sitting there lying, to my face with such ease that it made me question everything I thought I knew about him. How could someone compartmentalize like this? How could he eat his own cooking while watching me prepare to consume something he'd deliberately contaminated? I pushed the pasta around my plate, buying time while my mind worked frantically. I needed to get out of this situation without raising his suspicions, but I also needed to figure out what was happening and why. "Actually, I'm not feeling very well," I said finally, setting down my fork. "I think I might be coming down with something. Maybe I should just have some tea and crackers tonight." Derek's face showed immediate concern, but I caught something else in his expression, something that might have been disappointment or frustration. It was subtle, gone almost, as quickly as it appeared, but it confirmed my worst fears. He wanted me to eat that food. He needed me to eat it. "Are you sure?" he pressed. "You barely ate lunch and you've been working such long hours. You need your strength." He reached across the table and touched my hand. "At least try a few bites. I put a lot of effort into this." The persistence made my skin crawl. This wasn't a concerned husband encouraging his wife to maintain her health. This was something else entirely, something calculated and manipulative. I managed what I hoped was a convincing smile. "I really don't think I can keep anything heavy down right now, but thank you for cooking. It smells wonderful." I stood and kissed his forehead, a gesture that felt like betrayal even as I performed it. "I'm going to take a hot shower and go to bed early. Don't wait up for me, okay?" Derek nodded, but I could feel his eyes following me as I left the kitchen. Once upstairs, I locked the bathroom door and turned on the shower to mask any sound. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and tried to think clearly. Who could I call? What could I even say? That I thought my husband was drugging me. It sounded insane even in my own head. But I knew what I'd seen. The vial, the careful addition of its contents, the practiced ease of the motion. This wasn't the first time. The thought made me nauseous. How many meals had I eaten without knowing they'd been tampered with? How many times had Derek sat across from me, making conversation while watching me consume whatever he'd added to my food? I stayed in the bathroom for nearly an hour, letting the shower run while I tried to formulate a plan. When I finally emerged, the house was quiet. Derek had cleaned up the kitchen. I could hear the dishwasher running, and a soft glow from the television suggested he was in the living room. I slipped into our bedroom and quietly closed the door. Sleep was impossible. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hyper-aware of every sound Derek made as he moved around the house. When he finally came to bed around 11, I feigned sleep, controlling my breathing while he settled beside me. The man lying next to me felt like a stranger. How had I missed this? What other secrets was he keeping? The next morning brought no clarity, only more questions. Derek was already dressed for work when I woke up, and he brought me coffee in bed with a gentle smile. "Feeling better this morning?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the mattress. I accepted the coffee but didn't drink it, claiming my stomach was still unsettled. Derek's face showed that same fleeting expression of disappointment I'd noticed the night before. He kissed my forehead and reminded me to take care of myself, but his concern felt hollow now, performed rather than genuine. After he left for his job at the regional insurance office, I dumped the coffee down the bathroom sink and stood staring at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me appeared normal, tired perhaps, but not like someone whose husband had been secretly drugging her. That disconnect between appearance and reality felt disorienting. How long had I been living a lie without knowing it? I called in sick to the digital marketing agency where I worked, something I rarely did. But I needed time to think and investigate. The house felt different with Derek gone, like I was seeing it clearly for the first time. I started in the kitchen, searching for evidence of whatever he'd been adding to my food. The spice rack yielded nothing unusual, nor did the pantry or refrigerator. His pockets had been empty when I checked his work clothes in the laundry basket. It was in his dresser drawer that I found the first concrete proof. Hidden beneath his undershirts was a small cardboard box, the kind used for prescription medications. Inside were 6 vials identical to the one I'd seen him use, each filled with a white powder and labeled only with cryptic abbreviations that meant nothing to me. My hands shook as I photographed each vial, the evidence both validating my fears and making them terrifyingly real. But finding the vials raised more questions than it answered. What was this substance? Where had Derek obtained it? Most importantly, why was he giving it to me? The rational part of my mind searched for innocent explanations, but came up empty. There was no scenario in which secretly medicating your spouse was acceptable or legal. I spent the morning researching online, trying to identify the powder, based on its appearance, but the internet offered too many possibilities and none of them comforting. Some results suggested sedatives, others pointed to more exotic substances. Without proper testing, I couldn't know for certain what Derek had been feeding me, but the fact that he was hiding it told me everything I needed to know about his intentions. The sound of a car door slamming outside made me freeze. Through the bedroom window, I could see Derek's sedan in our driveway. He was home hours early, and I was still holding the box of vials. Panic shot through me as I quickly returned everything to its hiding place and tried to compose myself. Why was he back? Had he somehow known I was investigating? His footsteps on the stairs sounded unusually heavy, and when the bedroom door opened, Derek's expression was unlike anything I'd ever seen from him. Gone was the caring husband facade. In its place was something cold and calculating that made my blood freeze. "Looking for something, Amanda?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a threat I'd never heard before. The realization that Derek had caught me searching his belongings sent adrenaline surging through my system, but I forced myself to remain calm. Years of working in marketing had taught me to think quickly under pressure, and right now, my life might depend on that skill. I turned to face him, hoping my expression appeared innocent rather than terrified. "I was just looking for batteries," I said, gesturing toward the bedside table. "The remote died, and I thought you might have some in your drawer." The lie came easily, surprising me with its smoothness. I didn't feel like going downstairs to check the kitchen. Derek studied my face for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. I could see him weighing my explanation, searching for cracks in my story. Finally, his expression softened slightly, though it didn't return to the warmth I'd once known. "Batteries are in the hall closet," he said. "Top shelf, in the red toolbox." "Thanks," I replied, moving toward the door. "I thought you were working. Late today. Everything okay at the office?" "Slow afternoon," Derek answered, but something in his tone suggested there was more to his early return. "Thought I'd come home and take care of my wife." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You were pretty sick last night." The emphasis he placed on "take care of" made my skin crawl, but I managed a grateful smile. "That's sweet of you. I'm feeling much better today, actually. I think whatever it was passed quickly." Derek nodded, but I caught him glancing toward his dresser. Had I left some trace of my search? I'd been careful to replace everything exactly as I'd found it, but paranoia made me second-guess every movement. "Why don't you rest some more?" he suggested. "I'll make you some soup for lunch, something light and easy on your stomach." The offer that should have been caring instead filled me with dread. More food meant another opportunity for him to add whatever was in those vials. "Actually, I was thinking of going for a walk," I said quickly. "Fresh air might help clear my head. Maybe I'll stop by your Aunt Maggie's place and see how she's doing." Derek's reaction was immediate and telling. His face darkened with what looked like genuine anger before he caught himself and forced a smile. "Maggie's having a difficult time lately," he said carefully. The assisted living facility thinks she might be developing dementia. It might be better to wait until she's having a clearer day. This was news to me. Maggie Thompson, Derek's 78-year-old aunt, had seemed perfectly sharp when I'd seen her at a family gathering just 2 months ago. She was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, kept meticulous financial records, and could recall conversations from decades past with startling clarity. The idea that she was suddenly developing dementia seemed suspicious, especially given Derek's obvious discomfort with my suggestion to visit her. "Oh no," I said, injecting concern into my voice. "That's terrible. When did this start?" She seemed fine at Labor Day barbecue. "It's been gradual," Derek replied, but his explanation felt rehearsed. "You know how these things progress. Good days and bad days. The staff at Pine Valley says she gets confused easily now. Makes up stories about things that never happened." Makes up stories. The phrase sent a chill down my spine. Was Maggie making up stories, or was Derek trying to discredit anything she might say? I thought about the few times I'd interacted with Derek's aunt over the years. She'd always been kind to me, but there had been moments when she'd seemed to want to tell me something, only to have Derek interrupt or change the subject. At the time, I'd attributed it to family dynamics, but now those memories took on a different significance. "Maybe I could just call her," I suggested, watching Derek's reaction carefully. "Let her know we're thinking about her." "The facility has been limiting her phone calls," Derek said quickly. "Too much stimulation isn't good for her condition. The doctors think it's best if family visits are scheduled through the staff." Every excuse Derek offered only deepened my suspicions. Why was he so determined to keep me away from his aunt? What was he afraid she might tell me? I nodded as if accepting his explanation, but mentally I was already planning to visit Maggie as soon as possible. If Derek was lying about her condition, she might be an ally I desperately needed. "Well, I should let you rest," Derek said, moving toward the door. "I'll be downstairs if you need anything. And Amanda?" He paused in the doorway. "Next time you're looking for something, just ask me. I don't like the idea of you straining yourself by searching through drawers when you're not feeling well." The comment was delivered with a caring tone, but the underlying message was clear. He was warning me not to snoop through his belongings again. I waited until I heard his footsteps on the stairs before allowing myself to breathe freely. My hands were trembling again, and I realized the full magnitude of my situation was finally sinking in. I was married to someone who was actively deceiving me, possibly poisoning me, and now I was certain he was lying about his aunt's condition to keep us apart. The question that haunted me most was why. What did Derek gain by drugging me? Was he trying to make me sick? Control my behavior? Keep me compliant and docile? The possibilities were terrifying, but I forced myself to think logically. If I was going to escape this situation, I needed more than suspicions and a handful of mysterious vials. I needed proof, allies, and most importantly, a plan. I spent the next hour lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling while my mind raced through possibilities. The smell of cooking drifted up from the kitchen, and despite everything, my stomach reminded me that I hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. But accepting food from Derek was no longer an option. I would have to find ways to avoid eating anything he prepared without making him suspicious. When Derek called me for lunch, I went downstairs with a strategy in mind. The soup he'd prepared looked innocent enough, but I'd learned not to trust appearances. "This smells wonderful," I said, settling at the kitchen table. "You're so good to me." Derek beamed at the compliment, and for a moment I saw a flash of the man I'd fallen in love with. The contrast between that familiar warmth and what I now knew about him was jarring. How had I been so wrong about someone I'd shared my life with for 6 years? I made a show of tasting the soup, praising its flavor while secretly holding it in my mouth until I could discreetly spit it into my napkin. When Derek turned away, the deception felt necessary but disgusting. This was what my marriage had become, a performance where I pretended to trust the man who was betraying me in ways I was only beginning to understand. "I was thinking," Derek said as he ate his own bowl of soup with obvious enjoyment, "maybe we should plan a little getaway, somewhere quiet where you can really recover from this bug you've been fighting." The suggestion made my blood run cold. A getaway would isolate me completely, remove me from any potential help or witnesses. "That sounds lovely," I managed, "but I have that big campaign launch next week. Maybe after things settle down at work?" Derek's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Work will always be there, Amanda. Your health is more important. I could call your boss, explain that you need some time off for medical reasons." The persistence was alarming. Derek was pushing for something that would separate me from my job, my colleagues, anyone who might notice if something happened to me. I realized that whatever timeline he was operating on, it was accelerating. The discovery of his food tampering had somehow triggered a more aggressive approach. "Let me think about it," I said carefully. "Maybe you're right. I have been feeling run down lately." Derek reached across the table and took my hand, his thumb stroking my wedding ring. "I just want what's best for you," he said softly. "I want to take care of you the way you deserve." The words that should have been loving felt like a threat. I managed to smile and squeezed his hand in return, all while my mind screamed warnings. As soon as I could reasonably excuse myself, I went back upstairs and began planning in earnest. Whatever Derek was doing, whatever he had planned, I needed to act fast. The first step was getting to Maggie Thompson, despite Derek's attempts to keep us apart. If she was truly developing dementia, then I would deal with that reality. But if Derek was lying about her condition to isolate potential allies, then Maggie might be the key to understanding what was really happening. She'd known Derek far longer than I had, and she might have insights into his behavior that I desperately needed. I waited until Derek left for a meeting that afternoon, claiming he needed to handle some paperwork at the office. As soon as his car disappeared around the corner, I grabbed my keys and headed for Pine Valley Senior Community. The facility was only 20 minutes away, and if Derek was lying about restricting Maggie's visitors, I would be able to see her without raising suspicions. The drive gave me time to think about what I would say to Maggie, how much I should reveal about my suspicions. If Derek had been lying about her mental state, then she was probably sharp enough to handle the truth. But if she really was developing cognitive issues, I didn't want to frighten or confuse her with wild accusations about her nephew. Pine Valley Senior Community was a well-maintained facility with manicured gardens and a welcoming lobby. The receptionist, a cheerful woman in her 40s, greeted me warmly when I asked to visit Maggie Thompson. "Oh, Mrs. Thompson will be so pleased to see you," she said, checking her computer. She was just mentioning yesterday that she hadn't seen any family members in weeks. She's in the activity room right now, working on one of her crossword puzzles. The receptionist's words confirmed my suspicions. If Maggie was mentioning the lack of family visits, she was clearly aware and oriented enough to track time and relationships. Derek's claims about her confusion and the facility's visitor restrictions were lies, just as I'd suspected. I found Maggie exactly where the receptionist had indicated, sitting at a small table near a large window, a crossword puzzle book open in front of her. She looked up as I approached, and her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Amanda, dear," she exclaimed, rising to give me a warm hug. "What a wonderful surprise. I was just thinking about you the other day." Maggie looked exactly as I remembered her, sharp, alert, and completely present. There was no sign of the confusion or disorientation Derek had described. If anything, she seemed more vibrant than some people half her age. "Hi, Maggie," I said, returning her hug. "I hope I'm not interrupting your puzzle time." "Nonsense," she replied, gesturing for me to sit beside her. "I'm always happy for company, especially family. How have you been, sweetheart? You look a bit tired." The observation was gentle but perceptive, exactly what I would expect from someone with all her faculties intact. I settled into the chair beside her, trying to decide how to approach the conversation I needed to have. "I've been having some health issues lately," I said carefully. "Derek's been very attentive." Something shifted in Maggie's expression at the mention of Derek's name. It was subtle, but I caught a flicker of concern that she quickly masked. "I see," she said quietly. "And how is Derek these days? I haven't heard from him in quite some time." "He mentioned that the facility had been limiting your contact with family," I said, watching her reaction. "Something about your condition, making phone calls too stimulating." Maggie's eyebrows shot up, and for a moment, anger flashed across her features. "My condition?" she repeated. "What condition would that be? I'm sharper than most people a quarter my age, and everyone here knows it." The confirmation of Derek's lies sent relief flooding through me, followed immediately by renewed fear. If he was lying about Maggie's mental state, what else was he lying about? And why was he so determined to keep us apart? "Maggie," I said, lowering my voice and glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Has Derek ever done anything that worried you? Anything that seemed off?" Maggie studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her weighing how much to reveal. Finally, she leaned closer and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Amanda, dear, I've been wanting to talk to you for months, but Derek always seems to be listening whenever you're around. There are things about my nephew that you need to know, things that go back years. But first, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. Do you think Derek might be trying to hurt you?" The direct question caught me off guard, but the concern in Maggie's eyes told me she already suspected something was wrong. This wasn't a woman suffering from dementia or confusion. This was someone who had been watching, waiting, and worrying about the same things that were now terrifying me. "Yes," I whispered back, the admission feeling like a dam breaking inside. "Me. I think he's been putting something in my food." Maggie's face went pale, but she didn't look surprised. Instead, she looked like someone whose worst fears had just been confirmed. She reached across the table and gripped my hand tightly. "Oh, Amanda," she said softly. "I was so afraid this day would come. We need to talk, and we need to do it somewhere Derek can't interrupt us. There are things about his past, about his first marriage, that you need to know right away." Maggie's words about Derek's first marriage hit me like ice water. First marriage? In all our years together, Derek had never mentioned being married before. According to everything he'd told me, I was his first and only wife. The lies were multiplying faster than I could process them. "First marriage?" I repeated, my voice barely audible. "Derek told me he'd never been married before." Maggie's expression darkened with a mixture of anger and sadness. "Of course he did. That's exactly what I was afraid of." She glanced around the activity room, noting the other residents engaged in their various pursuits, then leaned even closer. Her name was Rachel. Sweet girl, about your age when they married. She was a nurse at the hospital where Derek used to work before he moved to insurance. My mind reeled. Derek had worked at a hospital? Another detail about his past that he'd never shared. "What happened to her?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. "She died," Maggie said simply, watching my face carefully. "Very suddenly, very unexpectedly. She'd been complaining about feeling unwell for months before. It happened. Fatigue, confusion, memory problems. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with her." The parallels to my own recent experiences made my stomach lurch. The unexplained tiredness, the morning brain fog, the general sense of being unwell, that I'd attributed to work stress, Had Derek been slowly poisoning his first wife the same way he was poisoning me? How did she die? I whispered. Heart failure, Maggie replied. Completely unexpected in someone so young and healthy. She was only 32. Her grip on my hand tightened. The thing is, Amanda, Rachel started getting suspicious near the end. She mentioned to me once that she thought Derek might be putting something in her food. I thought she was being paranoid. Maybe the stress of her illness was affecting her. Judgment. I didn't take her seriously enough. The guilt in Maggie's voice was unmistakable. She blamed herself for not believing Rachel, for not protecting her when she'd reached out for help. Did anyone investigate after she died? There was an autopsy, but Derek was very involved in the process. He had connections at the hospital, knew which strings to pull. The official cause of death was listed as sudden cardiac arrest due to an undiagnosed heart condition. Case closed. Maggie's voice carried years of suppressed suspicion and regret. But I never believed it. Rachel was a nurse. She would have known if she had a heart condition. I thought about Derek's behavior over the past few days. His insistence that I eat the food he prepared. His suggestion of a getaway. His lies about Maggie's condition. The pattern was becoming terrifyingly clear. Do you think he killed her? I think Rachel got too close to the truth, Maggie said quietly. And I think Derek decided she couldn't be allowed to expose him. She paused, studying my face. The question is, what are we going to do to make sure the same thing doesn't happen to you? The weight of the situation crashed over me fully. I wasn't just dealing with a husband who was being deceptive or even abusive. I was potentially married to a murderer who was actively trying to harm me, possibly kill me. The realization should have sent me into panic, but instead, it crystallized my resolve. I wouldn't be Rachel. I wouldn't be another victim of Derek's manipulation and violence. I need proof, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Something concrete that will hold up if I go to the police. Maggie nodded approvingly. Smart girl, but we need to be careful about how we go about it. Derek is clever, and he's had years to perfect his methods. She paused, then added, There's something else you should know. Derek didn't just inherit money when Rachel died. He collected a substantial life insurance payout. The financial motive added another layer of horror to the situation. Derek hadn't just killed his first wife out of some twisted psychological need. He'd profited from her death. How much? $500,000, Maggie replied. Enough to pay off his debts, buy a new house, start fresh. Rachel had increased her policy just 6 months before she died, at Derek's suggestion. He convinced her they needed more coverage because they were thinking about starting a family. I felt sick. The calculated nature of Derek's actions, the way he'd manipulated Rachel into increasing her life insurance before killing her, spoke to a level of premeditation that was chilling. Does he have a policy on me too? I don't know, Maggie admitted. But given his pattern, I'd be surprised if he didn't. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notepad. I've been keeping track of things over the years, instances, where Derek's behavior didn't add up. Inconsistencies in his stories about Rachel's death. I never had enough to take to the police, but now that you're in danger, maybe together we can build a case. Maggie's notes were meticulous, dating back years. She'd documented conversations with Derek where his story about Rachel's illness had changed, times when he'd seemed unusually interested in Maggie's own health and finances, observations about his controlling behavior with both wives. Reading through her careful handwriting, I realized that Maggie had been conducting her own investigation for years, waiting for the right moment to act. Why didn't you ever warn me before now? I asked, not accusingly, but genuinely curious. I tried, Maggie said sadly. Do you remember at Christmas 2 years ago when I asked to speak with you privately? Derek interrupted before I could say anything meaningful. Or at the 4th of July barbecue last year, when I mentioned wanting to tell you some family stories? Derek steered the conversation away every time I got close to bringing up Rachel. I did remember those moments, though at the time I'd attributed Derek's interruptions to normal family dynamics. Now I realized he'd been actively preventing Maggie from warning me about his true nature. The level of control he'd been exerting over my relationships extended far beyond what I'd recognized. "We need to be smart about this," Maggie continued. "Derek can't know that we've talked or that you're suspicious. If he realizes you're onto him, he might accelerate his timeline." The thought of Derek becoming more aggressive in his attempts to harm me was terrifying. But Maggie was right. I needed to continue playing the role of the unsuspecting wife, while gathering evidence and building a case against him. "What do you suggest?" "First, we need to get those vials you found tested. I have a friend whose daughter works at a private lab. She might be able to help us identify what Derek's been giving you without involving official channels that might tip him off." Maggie tore a page from her notepad and wrote down a name and phone number. "Second, we need to document everything. Every time he tries to give you food or drink, every lie he tells, every controlling behavior. Build a pattern that investigators can't ignore." I thought about the challenges of gathering evidence while living under the same roof as my potential killer. How do I avoid eating what he prepares without making him suspicious? "Get creative," Maggie advised. "Claim you're on a new diet, or that your doctor recommended specific foods for your health issues. Make it seem like you're taking control of your nutrition rather than avoiding his. And when you do have to eat with him, find ways to dispose of the food without actually consuming it." We spent the next hour developing strategies for gathering evidence while maintaining the facade of normal married life. Maggie's experience and perspective proved invaluable. She understood Derek's psychology in ways I was only beginning to grasp, and her years of observation had given her insights into his methods and motivations. "There's one more thing," Maggie said as our conversation wound down. "Derek has always been obsessed with control, even as a child. His first wife, Rachel, wasn't his first victim. When he was in high school, his girlfriend at the time, Sarah Miller, ended up in the hospital with mysterious symptoms. The doctors never figured out what was wrong with her, but she recovered after she broke up with Derek. The pattern stretched back decades. Derek hadn't suddenly become dangerous when he married Rachel. He'd been perfecting his methods for years, learning how to harm people in ways that wouldn't be easily detected or traced back to him. The realization that I'd married not just a killer, but a serial poisoner, was almost too much to process. "How do we stop him?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of Derek's crimes and the danger I was in. "Carefully," Maggie replied. "But we will stop him, Amanda. Rachel deserves justice, and you deserve to live. We're going to make sure Derek pays for what he's done." As I prepared to leave Pine Valley, Maggie gave me her personal cell phone number and made me promise to check in with her daily. "If I don't hear from you for more than 24 hours, I'm calling the police," she said firmly. "Derek may have fooled everyone else, but he's not fooling me anymore." The drive home gave me time to process everything Maggie had revealed. The scope of Derek's deception was staggering. Not only had he hidden an entire previous marriage from me, but he'd likely murdered his first wife and was now attempting to do the same to me. The man I'd thought I knew, the man I'd built a life with, was a complete fabrication. When I arrived home, Derek's car was already in the driveway. My heart rate spiked as I realized I'd been gone longer than intended. How would I explain my absence? I needed a story that would satisfy his questions, without raising his suspicions. Derek was in the kitchen when I entered, and his smile seemed forced. "There you are," he said, checking his watch. I was starting to worry. "Where did you go?" "Just for a drive," I replied, hanging my keys on the hook by the door. I needed some fresh air, and I thought it might help clear my head. I ended up at that little park by the river, just sitting and thinking. Derek studied my face, and I could see him evaluating my explanation. You were gone for over 2 hours. That's a long time to sit in a park. The time awareness was troubling. Had Derek been tracking my movements? I guess I lost track of time, I said with what I hoped was a casual shrug. It felt good to just be quiet for a while. I think I might be feeling better than I have in days. That's wonderful news, Derek said, but his eyes remained calculating. I was just starting dinner. I picked up some fresh fish from that market you like. I thought we could have a nice meal together. Just the two of us. The offer of another meal he'd prepared sent alarm bells ringing in my head, but I forced myself to appear pleased. That sounds lovely. Let me just go freshen up and I'll be right down to help. No need, Derek replied quickly. I want to take care of everything tonight. You just relax. The insistence on handling the food preparation himself confirmed my worst fears. Whatever Derek had planned for dinner, he wanted to ensure I had no opportunity to see what he was adding to it. I nodded and headed upstairs, my mind racing with plans for avoiding another poisoned meal. In the bathroom, I texted Maggie's friend's daughter about getting the vials tested, using a secure messaging app Derek wouldn't be able to monitor. The response came back quickly. She could meet me tomorrow during her lunch break to collect samples for analysis. The testing would take a few days, but it would give us definitive answers about what Derek had been feeding me. When I returned to the kitchen, Derek had prepared an elaborate meal of grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and rice pilaf. The presentation was beautiful, and under different circumstances, I would have been touched by his effort. Now, all I could see was another weapon disguised as a gesture of love. This looks incredible, I said, settling at the table. You've really outdone yourself. Derek beamed with pride as he served our plates. I wanted tonight to be special. I feel like we haven't been connecting lately, and I thought a nice dinner might help us reconnect. The irony of his words was staggering. We hadn't been connecting because he'd been systematically poisoning me while lying about every aspect of his past. But I smiled and played my part, praising the food while finding ways to avoid actually eating it. The salmon was easier to handle than the pasta had been. I could cut it into small pieces and move them around my plate while pretending to eat. When Derek wasn't looking, I slipped pieces into my napkin or let them fall onto the floor for our cat to investigate later. The vegetables presented more of a challenge, but I managed to dispose of most of them using similar tactics. Derek ate his own meal with obvious enjoyment, keeping up a stream of conversation about his day at work and plans for the weekend. His ability to maintain normal small talk while watching me consume poisoned food was deeply disturbing. How did someone develop that level of compartmentalization? I've been thinking more about that getaway, Derek said as we finished dinner. I found a cabin in the mountains that looks perfect, very secluded, peaceful. We could leave Friday after work and have a long weekend to ourselves. The secluded location set off every alarm in my head. Derek was definitely planning something that required privacy and isolation. That does sound nice, I said carefully. Can you send me the details? I'd like to see what you found. It's a surprise, Derek replied. I want to handle all the arrangements myself. You just need to pack some warm clothes and leave everything else to me. The refusal to share details about the location was another red flag. Derek wanted me isolated and uninformed, completely dependent on him in an unfamiliar place where no one would think to look for me if something happened. I realized that this weekend getaway might be his endgame, the culmination of whatever plan he'd been building toward. That's so thoughtful of you, I managed, even as my mind raced through ways to avoid the trip without arousing suspicion. I can't wait. After dinner, Derek suggested we watch a movie together, something we used to do regularly in the early years of our marriage. As we settled on the couch, he brought me a cup of tea, claiming it would help soothe my lingering stomach issues. The tea was a new challenge. Unlike solid food, I couldn't pretend to drink it while secretly disposing of it. This smells wonderful, I said, holding the mug and letting the steam warm my face. "What kind is it?" "Chamomile with honey," Derek replied, settling beside me with his own mug. "My mother used to make it for me when I was sick as a child. It's very relaxing." I watched Derek drink his tea normally, which meant either his mug contained something different than mine, or he'd developed immunity to whatever he was using to drug me. The latter possibility was particularly chilling, suggesting long-term planning and experimentation. As the movie played, I pretended to sip my tea while actually keeping my lips sealed against the liquid. When Derek went to the bathroom during a commercial break, I quickly dumped half the contents into a nearby plant pot. By the time he returned, the mug appeared to be at the level it would be if I'd been drinking steadily. The effects Derek expected from the tea became apparent as the evening progressed. He kept glancing at me expectantly, as if waiting for something to happen. When I remained alert and engaged with the movie, I could see his frustration growing. Whatever substance he'd added to my tea was supposed to be taking effect by now. "Are you feeling tired?" Derek asked during the movie's climax. "You look like you might be ready for bed." I wasn't tired at all, thanks to avoiding most of the drugged tea, but Derek clearly expected me to be experiencing sedative effects. "A little," I lied, stretching and yawning for effect. That tea was very relaxing. "Why don't you head up to bed?" Derek suggested. "I'll clean up down here and join you in a few minutes." The suggestion felt like a test. If the drugs had worked as intended, I should be compliant and drowsy, ready to do whatever Derek suggested. I forced myself to appear groggy as I stood up. "That sounds good. Thank you for such a lovely evening." Derek kissed my forehead, and the gesture that had once felt loving now felt possessive and threatening. "Sleep well, sweetheart. I'll be up soon." Upstairs, I went through the motions of preparing for bed while my mind worked frantically. Derek's increasing aggression, the planned isolation trip, and his obvious frustration when his drugs didn't work as expected all pointed to an escalating timeline. Whatever he had planned, it was happening soon. I lay in bed pretending to sleep when Derek finally came upstairs. He moved quietly, clearly trying not to wake what he believed was his drugged and unconscious wife. But instead of getting ready for bed himself, he went to his dresser and retrieved something from the drawer where I'd found the vials. Through barely opened eyes, I watched Derek examine what appeared to be a syringe. My blood turned to ice as I realized that if the oral drugs weren't working effectively enough, Derek might be planning to inject me with something while I slept. The escalation from pills hidden in food to direct injection represented a dramatic increase in danger. Derek stood beside the bed for several long minutes, syringe in hand, studying my supposedly sleeping form. I concentrated on keeping my breathing steady and my body relaxed, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run. Finally, Derek seemed to decide against using the syringe immediately. He returned it to his dresser and got ready for bed. As Derek settled beside me, I realized that tomorrow might be my last chance to gather evidence and escape. His plan was clearly accelerating, and my continued resistance to his drugs was forcing him to consider more direct methods. The weekend getaway wasn't just about isolation. It was about having the privacy and time to kill me without interruption. I waited until Derek's breathing indicated he was truly asleep, before allowing myself to process the full horror of my situation. I was sharing a bed with a man who was planning to murder me, possibly within days. The syringe suggested he was prepared to use more aggressive methods if his usual approach continued to fail. But I wasn't helpless. I had Maggie as an ally, evidence that could potentially expose Derek's crimes, and most importantly, I knew the truth about what he was planning. Tomorrow, I would begin the final phase of my own plan, one that would either save my life or put me in even greater danger. But staying passive and hoping for the best was no longer an option. Derek had made his choice when he decided to follow his pattern of murdering wives who became inconvenient. Now, it was time for me to make mine. The question that kept me awake for the rest of the night wasn't whether I would fight back against Derek's plans. It was whether I would be smart enough, fast enough, and careful enough to survive the battle that was coming. Rachel hadn't been able to expose Derek before he killed her, but I had advantages she hadn't possessed. I knew about Rachel's fate. I had Maggie's support, and most crucially, I knew what Derek was planning before he'd completed it. As dawn approached, I realized that my marriage was about to become a war for my survival, and I intended to win. The morning alarm felt like a lifeline after a sleepless night spent listening to Derek's breathing and planning my survival strategy. I moved carefully, maintaining the pretense of grogginess while Derek prepared for work. His morning routine seemed normal enough, but I caught him watching me more intently than usual, as if evaluating my condition after the previous night's failed sedation attempt. "How are you feeling this morning?" Derek asked, bringing me coffee in bed as he had countless times before. The gesture that once felt caring now carried sinister undertones. "Much better," I replied, accepting the mug but not drinking from it. "I think that tea really helped me sleep deeply." The lie came easily now, part of the performance that was keeping me alive. Derek's smile seemed forced, and I noticed his eyes lingering on my face, searching for signs of the effects he'd expected to see. When I remained alert and conversational, that familiar flash of frustration crossed his features before he masked it with false concern. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so glad you're feeling stronger." He kissed my forehead, and I had to fight not to recoil from his touch. "I have some meetings today, but I should be home by 6. Maybe we can finalize those weekend plans tonight." The mention of the weekend trip sent ice through my veins, but I managed an enthusiastic nod. "I'm really looking forward to it. It'll be nice to get away from everything." After Derek left for work, I waited 30 minutes before pouring the coffee down the bathroom sink and beginning my own preparations. Today would be crucial for gathering evidence and establishing my escape plan. I had to move fast but carefully, knowing that one mistake could alert Derek to my awareness of his intentions. My first stop was the bank where Derek and I held our joint accounts. The cheerful teller, a woman named Patricia who'd helped us with various transactions over the years, greeted me warmly as I approached her window. "Good morning, Mrs. Walsh. How can I help you today?" "I'd like to review our account statements for the past year," I said, hoping my voice sounded casual. "Derek and I are thinking about refinancing the house, and we need to gather some financial documentation." Patricia nodded and began pulling up our records. As she printed the statements, I scanned through them, looking for any unusual patterns or transactions I might have missed before. What I found was more disturbing than I'd anticipated. There were regular transfers from our joint savings account to a separate account I'd never known existed, always in amounts just small enough to avoid triggering automatic notifications. Over the past 18 months, Derek had systematically moved nearly $40,000 out of our shared funds. The timing corresponded with when I'd first started experiencing the unexplained fatigue and confusion. "Patricia," I said carefully, pointing to one of the transfers, "what can you tell me about this account? I don't recognize the number." Patricia checked her system and frowned slightly. "It's a personal account under your husband's name only. He opened it about 2 years ago." She paused, looking uncomfortable. "I probably shouldn't share details about accounts you're not listed on, but since you're married and these are transfers from your joint account." "It's fine," I assured her, my mind racing. "I'm sure Derek just set it up for some investment or surprise he's planning. You know how secretive husbands can be about those things." Patricia smiled and nodded, clearly relieved by my casual response. But internally, I was connecting more pieces of Derek's plan. The secret account suggested he'd been preparing financially for my death, possibly moving assets to protect them from any potential investigation, or to ensure they'd be accessible to him immediately after my demise. I requested copies of all the statements, claiming I needed them for our mortgage application. Patricia was happy to oblige, and I left the bank with concrete evidence of Derek's financial manipulation. The pattern was clear. He'd been systematically draining our joint resources while building a separate nest egg that only he could access. My next stop was the private lab where Maggie's contact worked. Dr. Sarah Chen, a toxicologist in her early 30s, met me in the parking lot during her lunch break. I'd brought one of Derek's vials, carefully extracted from his dresser that morning after he left for work. Maggie filled me in on the basics, Dr. Chen said, accepting the vial with gloved hands. I want you to know that if this contains what I think it might, we're talking about something very serious. What do you think it might be? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Dr. Chen examined the white powder through the glass. Based on Maggie's description of your symptoms, I suspect this could be a benzodiazepine derivative, or possibly a more exotic sedative. Something that would cause the fatigue, confusion, and memory issues you've been experiencing without being easily detectable in standard medical tests. The clinical explanation made my situation feel even more real and terrifying. Derek hadn't just been giving me random substances. He'd been using something sophisticated, something chosen specifically for its ability to incapacitate without being obvious. How long will the testing take? I asked. I can have preliminary results by tomorrow evening, Dr. Chen replied. Full analysis might take another day or two, but I'll prioritize this. Maggie made it clear that time is critical. As Dr. Chen drove away with the evidence that might finally expose Derek's crimes, I realized that I was committed to a path that would either lead to justice or put me in immediate danger. There was no going back now. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Thinking about you. Can't wait for our romantic weekend. Already packed some special surprises. The message sent chills down my spine. Special surprises likely meant he'd prepared whatever he planned to use to kill me during our isolated getaway. The casual tone of his text, as if he were genuinely excited about a romantic trip rather than planning murder, highlighted the depth of his psychological detachment. I spent the afternoon at the public library, using their computers to research Derek's past more thoroughly. What I discovered painted an even more disturbing picture of systematic deception. The hospital where he'd allegedly worked with Rachel had no employment records for anyone named Derek Walsh during the time frame he'd claimed. Either he'd used a different name, or that job had been entirely fictional. Digging deeper into public records, I found Derek's previous address history. He'd lived in 3 different states over the past 15 years, always moving within a year or 2 of each location. The pattern suggested someone who made a habit of starting over, possibly after events that made staying in one place inadvisable. Most chilling was what I found about Sarah Miller, the high school girlfriend Maggie had mentioned. A newspaper archive from Derek's hometown contained a brief article about a local teen who'd been hospitalized with mysterious symptoms that had baffled doctors. The girl had recovered fully after several weeks, but the article mentioned that police had briefly investigated the possibility of poisoning before concluding it was likely a rare allergic reaction. The article was dated 15 years ago, which meant Derek had been perfecting his methods for over a decade. Sarah Miller had been a test case, a way for him to learn how much of various substances he could administer without killing someone immediately. Rachel had been his first successful murder, and now I was intended to be his second. I printed every article and document I could find, building a comprehensive file of Derek's history and movements. The pattern was undeniable once you knew what to look for, but I understood why previous investigations had failed to connect the dots. Derek was careful to never stay in one place long enough for people to notice patterns, and he spaced his crimes far enough apart to avoid obvious connections. My research was interrupted by another text from Derek. Left work early, picking up supplies for our trip. See you soon, beautiful. Panic shot through me as I realized Derek was deviating from his normal schedule. If he came home and found me gone, he might become suspicious about what I was doing. I quickly gathered my research materials and headed home, my mind racing through explanations for my absence if Derek arrived first. I needn't have worried. Derek's car wasn't in the driveway when I arrived, giving me time to hide my research materials and compose myself before his return. When he finally walked through the front door carrying several shopping bags, his mood seemed unusually upbeat. "There's my beautiful wife," he said, setting down his bags and pulling me into an embrace that felt more possessive than affectionate. "I have such wonderful things planned for our weekend." "I can't wait to hear about them," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady while pressed against his chest. Being this close to Derek now felt like embracing a predator, knowing what he was capable of but having to pretend otherwise. Derek's shopping bags contained camping supplies, which struck me as odd since he'd mentioned a cabin rental. Sleeping bags, a portable camp stove, rope, and various other outdoor gear that suggested we might not be staying in civilized accommodations after all. The rope was particularly ominous, serving no obvious purpose for a romantic getaway. "I thought we might do some hiking," Derek explained when he noticed me examining his purchases. "There are some beautiful trails near the cabin, very secluded and peaceful, perfect for getting away from all the stress and distractions of daily life." Secluded and peaceful, away from stress and distractions. Derek's word choices felt like veiled threats, descriptions of the perfect location to commit murder without witnesses or interruptions. I forced enthusiasm into my response while my mind cataloged each item as potential evidence of premeditation. That evening, Derek prepared another elaborate dinner, this time featuring steaks and his special seasoning, blend. I went through the familiar routine of pretending to eat while actually disposing of the food. But Derek's observation of me seemed more intense than before. He was clearly growing frustrated with my continued resistance to his drugging attempts. "You're not eating much lately," Derek observed as I moved food around my plate. "Are you sure you're feeling better? Maybe we should postpone our trip until you've fully recovered." The suggestion of postponement sounded like a threat rather than genuine concern. Derek had invested too much in his weekend plans to abandon them easily. "I'm fine," I assured him. "Just trying to eat lighter meals. I read an article about how heavy foods can interfere with sleep quality." Derek accepted this explanation, but I could see his mind working, probably calculating how to adjust his dosages to account for my reduced food intake. The conversation shifted to details about our departure time and what I should pack. But underneath the domestic planning was an undercurrent of tension that made every exchange feel dangerous. After dinner, Derek suggested we watch another movie together, but this time he didn't bring me tea. Instead, he opened a bottle of wine, something we rarely did on weeknights. The deviation from his usual pattern put me on high alert. "To our weekend getaway," Derek said, raising his glass in a toast, "and to new beginnings." New beginnings. The phrase echoed what I'd seen in his social media posts with Hannah, back when I'd thought that was his worst betrayal. Now I understood that Derek's concept of new beginnings involved eliminating inconvenient wives rather than simply divorcing them. I touched my glass to his, but barely wet my lips with the wine. Derek drank deeply from his own glass, and I found myself wondering if he was building tolerance to his own substances, or if his glass contained something entirely different. The logistics of his poisoning operation were as disturbing as the crimes themselves. As the movie played, Derek's behavior became increasingly strange. He kept checking his phone, as if waiting for some kind of confirmation or signal. His attention wasn't on the film at all, despite his suggestion that we watch it together. Instead, he seemed to be going through the motions of a normal evening while his mind focused on other matters. "Everything okay at work?" I asked when his phone buzzed for the fourth time in 30 minutes. "Just some weekend preparations," Derek replied vaguely, "making sure everything's arranged properly for our trip." The explanation didn't ring. True. What kind of weekend trip required constant phone coordination on a Thursday evening? Unless Derek was coordinating with accomplices or making arrangements that went far beyond simple cabin rentals. Around 10 o'clock, Derek's phone rang, with an actual call rather than a text. He glanced at the screen and stood up abruptly. "I need to take this. Work emergency." He stepped into the kitchen to answer, but I could hear fragments of his conversation through the doorway. What I caught made my blood run cold. "Tomorrow night, like we discussed," Derek's voice carried clearly. "Remote location? Everything's prepared. No, there won't be any complications this time." The call lasted only a few minutes, but those overheard fragments confirmed my worst fears. Derek wasn't acting alone in whatever he had planned. Someone else was involved, someone who knew about his timeline and preparations. The scope of the conspiracy against me was larger than I'd realized. When Derek returned to the living room, his demeanor had shifted subtly. There was an anticipatory energy about him, like someone who'd just received confirmation that long-awaited plans were finally moving forward. "Everything sorted out?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual despite the terror coursing through. "All taken care of," Derek replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Tomorrow's going to be a very special day." I spent the rest of the evening in a state of hypervigilance, noting every detail of Derek's behavior and trying to piece together the full scope of his plan. The phone call had mentioned no complications this time, which suggested that previous attempts had encountered problems. Was he referring to Rachel's death, or had there been other victims I didn't know about? When we finally went to bed, Derek's restlessness was obvious. He tossed and turned, checked his phone multiple times, and seemed unable to settle into sleep. Meanwhile, I lay perfectly still, feigning unconsciousness while my mind raced through potential escape scenarios. Around midnight, Derek got up and went to his dresser again. This time, he withdrew what looked like a small bottle along with the syringe I'd seen before. In the dim light from the hallway, I watched him prepare what was clearly an injection of some kind. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain he'd hear it, but Derek was focused entirely on his preparations. He approached the bed with the loaded syringe, and I had to use every ounce of self-control to remain motionless. Derek stood beside me for several long minutes, clearly debating whether to proceed. Finally, he seemed to decide against it, returning the syringe to his dresser and getting back into bed. The near injection was a turning point for me. Derek was clearly escalating his methods, moving from oral drugs to considering direct injection, when his previous attempts proved insufficient. Tomorrow's getaway wasn't just about isolation. It was about having the privacy and time to use more aggressive methods without risk of discovery. I waited until Derek's breathing indicated deep sleep before carefully reaching for my phone. I needed to update Maggie and Dr. Chen about the accelerated timeline, but I also needed to begin implementing my own counter-strategy. Derek had spent months planning my murder, but I was about to turn his own methods against him. The next morning would bring the final phase of our deadly game. Derek expected to take a compliant, drugged wife to an isolated location where he could complete his plan without interference. Instead, he was about to discover that his intended victim had become a far more dangerous opponent than he'd anticipated. As I lay in the darkness planning my next moves, I realized that Derek's biggest mistake had been underestimating me. He'd seen me as just another Rachel, another victim to be manipulated and eliminated when convenient. But I had advantages Rachel hadn't possessed, and I intended to use every one of them to ensure that Derek's pattern of murder finally came to an end. The war for my survival was about to begin in earnest, and this time, I was going to be the one setting the terms of engagement. Friday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Derek woke me with gentle kisses and coffee, acting like the loving husband he'd once been. But I could see the barely contained excitement in his eyes, the anticipation of someone whose long-planned project was finally reaching completion. He moved through his morning routine with unusual efficiency, clearly eager to begin our weekend trip. "I've loaded most of our gear already," Derek announced, setting my coffee mug on the nightstand with careful precision. "We can leave as soon as you're ready after work." The drive isn't too long, but I want to arrive before dark to get properly settled. I accepted the coffee but kept it near my lips without drinking, a performance I'd perfected over the past few days. Sounds perfect. I'm really looking forward to disconnecting from everything. Derek's smile was radiant, and for a disturbing moment, I could see genuine happiness in his expression. He truly believed that by tonight, all his problems would be solved. His inconvenient wife would be eliminated. He'd collect whatever life insurance policies he'd secretly taken out on me, and he could start fresh with a new identity and a new location. After Derek left for work, I moved quickly to implement the final phase of my own plan. Dr. Chen had texted me early that morning with preliminary results from the vial testing. The substance was indeed a powerful benzodiazepine derivative, something that would cause progressive sedation and eventually respiratory depression in high enough doses. It was sophisticated, difficult to detect, and potentially lethal if administered consistently over time or in a single large dose. The confirmation of Derek's murder weapon gave me both relief and terror. Relief that I hadn't been losing my mind, that my symptoms had a concrete cause. Terror at how close I'd come to becoming his second victim without ever realizing the danger. I called Robert Chen, the attorney Maggie had recommended, and arranged an emergency meeting for my lunch break. His office was downtown, in a high-rise building that felt safely removed from Derek's sphere of influence. Robert Chen was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. Maggie briefed me on your situation, he said as I settled into the chair across from his desk. I want you to know that we're going to do everything in our power to protect you and bring Derek to justice. I spread out all the evidence I'd gathered over the past few days. Bank statements showing Derek's financial manipulation, documentation of his false identity claims, research proving his pattern of crimes across multiple states, and Dr. Chen's preliminary toxicology report. Robert examined each piece methodically, his expression growing more grave as he absorbed the scope of Derek's deception. This is compelling evidence, Robert said finally. But I'm concerned about your immediate safety. Based on what you've described about this weekend trip, Derek seems to be accelerating his timeline. I know, I replied. That's why I need to act now, before he has a chance to isolate me completely. Robert leaned back in his chair, considering our options. We could go to the police immediately with what we have. The toxicology results alone would warrant an investigation. But would they be able to arrest him today? Before tonight? I asked, knowing the answer even as I spoke. Probably not, Robert admitted. They'd want to conduct their own investigation, verify our evidence, build a stronger case. That process could take days or weeks. Days or weeks I didn't have. Derek's plan was in motion, and waiting for the legal system to catch up would likely mean becoming his next victim. Then I need to force his hand, make him reveal his intentions in a way that can't be denied or explained away. Robert looked uncomfortable with the direction of our conversation. Amanda, I can't advise you to put yourself in deliberate danger. If Derek is truly planning to kill you tonight, the safest course is to disappear, go into hiding until the authorities can build a case against him, and let him escape to start over somewhere else with a new identity and new victims. I shook my head firmly. No, this has to end tonight. I explained my plan to Robert, watching his expression shift from concern to professional admiration as he realized the elegance of my approach. It was risky, certainly, but it offered the best chance of exposing Derek's crimes in a way that would ensure justice for both Rachel and me. You'll need backup, Robert said after I finished outlining my strategy. People who know where you are and what's happening, who can call for help if things go wrong. Maggie's already coordinating that, I assured him. She has a network of people who've been watching Derek for years, waiting for the right moment to act. Robert prepared several legal documents while we spoke, including a detailed affidavit outlining Derek's crimes and my evidence against him. If my plan succeeded, these documents would ensure that Derek faced the full consequences of his actions. If my plan failed, they would at least provide a record of what had happened and why. I left Robert's office with a sense of grim determination. The next 12 hours would determine whether Derek's pattern of murder finally came to an end, or whether I would become another victim of his calculated brutality. But I was no longer the naive wife who had unknowingly consumed poisoned meals while trusting her husband's false affection. I was a woman who knew the truth, had gathered evidence, and was prepared to fight for her life. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Can't concentrate on work? Too excited about our romantic getaway. Picked up champagne to celebrate our time together. Champagne to celebrate. The irony was sickening. Derek was literally celebrating his anticipated success in murdering me, treating it like an achievement worthy of champagne toasts. His psychological detachment from the reality of his crimes was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his entire personality. I spent the afternoon at my graphic design agency, trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy while my mind raced through final preparations. My colleagues noticed my distraction, but I blamed it on excitement about the weekend trip. If anyone suspected that I might be heading into mortal danger, they gave no indication. Around 3 o'clock, Maggie called my work line. "Everything's in place," she said without preamble. "Our people will be positioned by 5 o'clock. Are you certain you want to go through with this?" "I'm certain," I replied, keeping my voice low to avoid being overheard by nearby coworkers. "Derek's not going to stop until someone stops him. This is our chance." "Just remember," Maggie cautioned, "Derek is intelligent and experienced. Don't underestimate his ability to adapt when things don't go according to his plan." I promised to be careful and ended the call, but Maggie's warning echoed in my mind for the rest of the afternoon. Derek had successfully murdered at least one person and had been planning my death for months. He wasn't going to be easily outmaneuvered, even with all our preparation and evidence. At 4:30, I left work and drove home to find Derek already there, loading final items into his SUV. He'd changed from his business attire into casual clothes suitable for camping, and his energy was unmistakably excited. This was a man who believed he was about to achieve something he'd been working toward for a very long time. "Perfect timing," Derek said, pulling me into an embrace that felt like a predator claiming its prey. "I was just finishing the packing. We can leave." "Whenever you're ready." I went upstairs to change clothes and gather my overnight bag, moving with deliberate slowness to buy time for Maggie's people to get into position. Derek had mentioned that our destination was about 2 hours away, which meant we'd arrive at the isolated cabin around sunset. Perfect timing for someone who wanted privacy for murder. In my bag, I packed the items that would either save my life or serve as evidence if my plan failed. A small recording device, backup copies of all my research, and a GPS tracker that would allow my allies to find me even if Derek tried to move my body after killing me. I also included a small knife, though I hoped the situation wouldn't deteriorate to the point where I'd need to use it. Derek was waiting by the car when I came downstairs, practically vibrating with anticipation. "Ready for our adventure?" he asked, taking my bag and loading it with the rest of our gear. "Absolutely," I replied, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. "I can't wait to see this amazing place you found." The drive began pleasantly enough, with Derek maintaining cheerful conversation about the scenery and his excitement about our romantic weekend. But as we left the main highways and began driving through increasingly remote areas, his demeanor started to shift. The loving husband facade was gradually being replaced by something colder and more calculating. "You know," Derek said about an hour into our journey, "I've been thinking about our future lately, about where we want to be in 5 years, 10 years. The topic seemed innocuous enough, but Derek's tone carried undercurrents that made me wary. "What kind of thoughts have you been having?" "About starting fresh," Derek replied, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. "Sometimes I think we get so bogged down in our daily routines that we lose sight of what's really important. Maybe we need a clean slate, a chance to reinvent ourselves completely. Clean slate. Reinvention. Derek was essentially describing the aftermath of my murder, the new life he'd build after eliminating the complications I represented. His ability to discuss his plans so obliquely while sitting next to his intended victim was deeply chilling. "That sounds wonderful," I managed, fighting to keep my voice steady. "What kind of fresh start are you thinking about?" Derek's smile in the rearview mirror was cold and predatory. "Oh, I think you'll be surprised by what I have in mind. Tonight's going to change everything for us." We turned onto a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest, leaving behind any pretense of civilization. The isolation was complete now, exactly what Derek needed for his plan to succeed without interference. But what he didn't know was that Maggie's people had been tracking our progress, maintaining a discreet distance while staying close enough to respond if needed. The cabin Derek had rented was even more remote than I'd anticipated, a small structure nestled deep in the woods, with no visible neighbors or nearby roads. It was the perfect place for someone to disappear without a trace, which had undoubtedly been Derek's primary criteria when making his selection. "Isn't this perfect?" Derek asked as we pulled up to the cabin. "Complete privacy, no distractions, just the two of us and all the time in the world." All the time in the world. From Derek's perspective, he had all night to complete his plan without fear of discovery or interruption. He began unloading our gear with obvious satisfaction, whistling softly as he carried bags into the cabin. His good mood was particularly disturbing, given what he believed this night would bring. Inside, the cabin was rustic but comfortable, with a single large room containing a bed, small kitchen area, and stone fireplace. Derek immediately began setting up what he claimed were romantic touches: candles, the champagne he'd mentioned, and a portable speaker for music. But I noticed that he also unpacked some items that had no place in a romantic getaway, including the rope I'd seen him purchase and several small bottles that undoubtedly contained the substances he planned to use on me. "Why don't you relax while I prepare dinner?" Derek suggested, gesturing toward the bed. "I brought everything we need for a special meal tonight." A special meal. The final poisoned dinner that Derek expected to incapacitate me completely, making the rest of his plans simple to execute. I settled onto the bed while Derek busied himself in the kitchen area, noting how he positioned his body to block my view of his food preparation. This time, he wasn't taking any chances with my ability to avoid consuming what he prepared. As Derek cooked, I activated the recording device hidden in my jacket, ensuring that everything that happened from this point forward would be preserved as evidence. I also sent a coded text message to Maggie, confirming our arrival and letting her know that Derek's plan was proceeding as expected. "Dinner's almost ready," Derek announced, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "I think tonight's meal is going to be particularly memorable." Memorable indeed, though not in the way Derek anticipated. As I watched him plate our food, with careful precision, adding his special ingredients to only one of the servings, I realized that the next few hours would determine whether justice would finally catch up with Derek Walsh, or whether his pattern of murder would claim another victim. The champagne cork popped with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet cabin, and Derek poured 2 glasses with ceremonial care. "To us," he said, raising his glass with a smile that no longer bothered to hide its predatory nature. "And to the end of all our problems." The end of all our problems. Derek truly believed that killing me would solve everything, would free him to start over somewhere else with a clean slate and no inconvenient connections to his past crimes. But as I accepted the champagne flute and prepared to begin the most dangerous performance of my life, I knew that Derek's problems were actually just beginning. Tonight would indeed be memorable, but not because Derek succeeded in adding another victim to his list. Tonight would be memorable because it was the Night that Derek Walsh's career as a serial killer finally came to an end, one way or another. The final act of our deadly game was about to begin. The champagne tasted bitter against my lips as Derek watched me with the intensity of a scientist observing a crucial experiment. I pretended to drink while actually letting most of the liquid remain in my mouth before discreetly spitting it back into the glass when Derek turned to adjust the cabin's lighting. Every swallow I avoided might mean the difference between consciousness and helplessness when his plan reached its climax. Derek had prepared what he announced as my favorite pasta dish, though the version before me looked distinctly different from his usual preparation. The sauce had an odd sheen to it, and I noticed crystalline residue around the edges of my plate that hadn't been there during his previous drugging attempts. He wasn't being subtle anymore. This was meant to be a massive dose, something that would incapacitate me completely within minutes. "You've outdone yourself," I said, picking up my fork and making a show of examining the meal appreciatively. "This looks incredible." Derek's smile was predatory as he settled across from me with his own plate, which I noticed looked completely different from mine, despite his claims that we were sharing the same meal. "I put extra care into tonight's dinner. I wanted it to be absolutely perfect." The recording device in my jacket was capturing every word, every inflection that revealed Derek's true intentions. As he began eating his untainted meal with obvious relish, I made elaborate gestures of tasting mine while actually consuming nothing. The performance required careful choreography, convincing Derek that I was ingesting his poison while actually disposing of it through sleight of hand. "You seem distracted tonight," Derek observed after several minutes. "Is everything all right?" The question carried an underlying tension. Derek expected his drugs to be taking effect by now, and my continued alertness was clearly frustrating him. I let my eyelids droop slightly and swayed a bit in my chair, giving him the show he wanted to see. "Just feeling relaxed," I mumbled, slurring my words slightly. "This place is so peaceful. The champagne is making me drowsy." Derek's posture shifted immediately, tension leaving his shoulders as he believed his plan was finally working. "Maybe you should lie down for a bit," he suggested with false concern. "I'll clean up here and join you shortly." I nodded groggily and made my way to the bed, stumbling slightly for effect while actually noting the positions of Derek's various supplies and potential weapons. The rope was coiled near his camping gear. The syringes were in a small bag by the kitchen counter, and I could see the outline of what looked like a knife handle protruding from beneath some folded clothing. As I lay on the bed feigning sedation, Derek moved around the cabin with newfound efficiency. He was no longer maintaining the pretense of a romantic getaway. This was a man preparing to commit murder, and his actions had the practiced quality of someone who had done this before. I heard Derek making a phone call, his voice low but carrying in the small space. "Everything's on schedule," he said to whoever was on the other end. "She's going down faster than expected. We can proceed as planned." The confirmation that Derek had accomplices waiting for his signal sent ice through my veins, but it also validated my decision to spring this trap tonight. If I had simply disappeared or gone to the police without concrete evidence, Derek would have aborted his plan and started over somewhere else with new victims. Derek ended his call and approached the bed where I lay with my eyes closed, breathing deeply to simulate unconsciousness. I felt him lean over me, his breath warm against my face as he checked for signs of awareness. When I remained completely still, he straightened up and began gathering his supplies. The sound of Derek preparing what was clearly a lethal injection was terrifying, but I forced myself to remain motionless. Through barely open eyelids, I watched him fill a syringe with liquid from one of his bottles, testing the mechanism and adjusting the dosage with clinical precision. This wasn't his first time administering a fatal injection. Derek returned to the bedside, syringe in hand, and began searching for a suitable injection site on my supposedly unconscious form. His touch was clinical and detached, like a veterinarian preparing to euthanize an animal. The complete absence of emotion or hesitation in his actions confirmed that Derek had moved far beyond any normal human capacity for empathy or remorse. "Goodbye, Amanda," Derek whispered as he positioned the needle against my arm. "You were a good wife, but all things must end." That was my cue to act. As Derek pressed the needle toward my skin, I grabbed his wrist with both hands, preventing the injection while simultaneously rolling away from him on the bed. Derek's shock at my sudden movement gave me the split second I needed to knock the syringe from his grasp, sending it flying across the room to shatter against the stone fireplace. "What the hell?" Derek snarled, his mask of false affection completely gone. In its place was something cold and vicious that made me understand how he had killed before, without remorse. "How are you awake? You should be unconscious by now." "I know what you are," I said, backing toward the center of the room while keeping Derek in sight. "I know about Rachel. I know about Sarah Miller. I know about all of it." Derek's expression shifted from shock to calculation as he processed this information. "Clever girl," he said, moving to block my path to the door. "I underestimated you. Rachel was never this resourceful." The casual reference to his first victim's murder confirmed everything I'd suspected. Derek was admitting to killing Rachel, probably assuming that I wouldn't live long enough to repeat his confession to anyone else. "How long have you known?" Derek asked, circling me slowly like a predator sizing up wounded prey. "Long enough to gather evidence," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. "Long enough to make sure everyone knows what you really are." Derek laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Evidence? Who's going to believe the ravings of a dead woman? By tomorrow morning, you'll be just another tragic accident. A young wife who fell from a cliff during a romantic hiking trip. Very sad, very believable." The revelation of his planned cover story was chilling in its simplicity. Derek had thought of everything, from the isolated location to the believable explanation for my death. He'd probably used similar scenarios before, perfecting his methods through experience with previous victims. "The police will investigate," I said, continuing to back away while Derek advanced. "They'll find inconsistencies in your story." "Will they?" Derek's smile was genuinely amused. "I work in insurance, Amanda. I know exactly how these investigations proceed, what evidence they look for, how to avoid raising suspicions. I've been doing this for years." Derek was confirming everything Maggie and I had suspected. This wasn't opportunistic violence, but a calculated pattern of murder that had been refined through practice. The admission was being recorded, but I needed to stay alive long enough for that evidence to matter. Derek lunged toward me suddenly, moving with surprising speed for someone I'd always considered sedentary. I barely managed to dodge his grasp, putting the small dining table between us as I tried to reach the kitchen area where I might find something to defend myself with. "You can't run forever," Derek said, his voice eerily calm despite the violence of his actions. "This cabin is miles from anywhere. Even if you escape temporarily, you'll never make it back to civilization." The isolation that Derek had counted on for privacy was now working against me, but I had advantages he didn't know about. Maggie's people were positioned in the surrounding area, and my GPS tracker was broadcasting my location continuously. I just needed to survive long enough for help to arrive. Derek feinted left, then grabbed right, catching my wrist and yanking me toward him with brutal force. Up close, I could see the complete absence of the man I'd thought I'd married. This was Derek's true face, the predator that had been hiding behind years of careful performance. "I really am sorry it has to end this way," Derek said, his grip on my wrist tightening painfully. "You were a good wife for a while, but you got too curious, started asking too many questions." I drove my knee upward, aiming for Derek's groin with all the force I could muster. The impact made him grunt and loosen his grip just enough for me to break free, but he recovered quickly and grabbed for me again. This time I was ready, raking my nails across his face and leaving deep scratches that drew blood. Derek touched his wounded cheek and looked at the blood on his fingers with mild interest. "That's going to complicate the accident scene," he mused. "I'll have to adjust the story to account for defensive wounds." His casual discussion of manipulating evidence, while actively trying to kill me, was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire encounter. Derek wasn't acting in passion or desperation. This was methodical, planned violence executed with the efficiency of long practice. I managed to reach the kitchen counter and grabbed the largest knife I could find, a heavy camping blade that Derek had brought for food preparation. The weight of it in my hand was reassuring, though I hoped I wouldn't have to use it. "Now we're getting somewhere," Derek said, pulling his own knife from the camping gear. "Though I should warn you, I have considerably more experience with weapons than you do." The threat was probably accurate, but I wasn't planning to engage Derek in knife combat. I was buying time while positioning myself near the cabin's front window, where Maggie's people would have the clearest line of sight if they needed to intervene. Derek advanced slowly, professional in his approach to what he clearly considered an inevitable outcome. "You know, Amanda, if you'd just eaten your dinner like a good wife, this could have been peaceful, painless. Now it's going to be much more unpleasant." "Like it was for Rachel?" I demanded, hoping to keep him talking while I maneuvered into position. "Did you make her death unpleasant too?" Derek's expression darkened at the mention of his first victim. Rachel brought her fate on herself. She started getting suspicious, asking questions, making accusations, just like you're doing now. "So you killed her to shut her up?" "I killed her because she was becoming a liability," Derek corrected. "Just like you have. Though I'll admit, the insurance money was a nice bonus." The callous admission was exactly what I needed recorded. Derek was confessing to premeditated murder motivated by both elimination of witnesses and financial gain. No jury would fail to convict based on this evidence, assuming I survived to present it. Derek shifted his grip on the knife and prepared to attack in earnest. "Enough talking. It's time to finish this." He lunged forward with the blade extended, aiming for my torso in what was clearly meant to be a killing blow. I threw myself sideways, feeling the knife blade slice through the air where I'd been standing. Derek's momentum carried him past me, giving me the opening I needed to reach the cabin door. I yanked the door open and stumbled outside into the cool night air, Derek close behind me. The forest around the cabin was dark and uninviting, but it offered cover that the cabin's interior had lacked. More importantly, it put me in the open where Maggie's backup could see what was happening. Derek emerged from the cabin seconds after me, no longer bothering with stealth or subtlety. "Running will only make this harder on yourself," he called out. "You can't hide from me out here." I could hear Derek crashing through the underbrush behind me as I fled deeper into the woods, but I could also hear something else. The distant sound of engines, vehicles approaching the remote cabin at high speed. Maggie's people were closing in, drawn by the GPS signal and probably the sounds of our struggle. Derek heard the engines too, and his pursuit became more desperate. He couldn't afford to let me reach the approaching vehicles alive, not when I could expose his crimes and destroy the carefully constructed identity he'd built over years of deception. "You called for help," Derek snarled, gaining ground as I struggled through the dense forest. "Clever, but they won't arrive in time to save you." Derek tackled me from behind, sending us both crashing to the forest floor in a tangle of limbs and dead leaves. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs, but I managed to retain my grip on the camping knife. Derek's weight pinned me down as he raised his own blade for what he intended to be the final strike. That's when the flashlight beams cut through the darkness, accompanied by shouting voices and the sound of people moving quickly through the forest. Derek's head snapped up, his attack hesitating as he realized that his plan had collapsed completely. "Police! Drop your weapons!" The authoritative command came from multiple directions as law enforcement officers surrounded our position. Derek's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to rage, to the calculating look of someone weighing impossible odds. For a moment, I thought Derek might surrender. The evidence against him was overwhelming, his plan had failed, and he was outnumbered and outgunned. But then I saw the decision form in his eyes, the same cold determination that had led him to murder Rachel and attempt to kill me. Instead of dropping his knife, Derek raised it higher, clearly intending to complete his attack even if it meant his own death in the process. He would rather kill me and die himself than face exposure and prosecution for his crimes. I rolled sideways, just as Derek brought the blade down, the knife striking the ground where my head had been a split second before. The motion put Derek off balance, giving me the opening I needed to drive my own knife upward into his shoulder. Derek screamed and jerked backward, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers as blood flowed from the wound. The police were on us immediately, subduing Derek while paramedics checked me for injuries. As Derek was cuffed and read his rights, I could see the realization dawning on his face that his career as a serial killer was finally over. There would be no escape, no new identity, no fresh start somewhere else with new victims. "You have no idea what you've done," Derek said as the officers prepared to transport him. I was providing a service, eliminating people who were better off dead anyway. The complete lack of remorse in his words confirmed everything I'd learned about Derek's psychology. He genuinely believed that murdering inconvenient wives was justified, that his victims deserved their fate. The depth of his delusion was staggering. Maggie arrived with the police convoy, her face a mixture of relief and vindication as she saw Derek in custody. "It's over," she said, embracing me carefully. "Rachel can finally rest in peace." The aftermath moved quickly once Derek was in custody. The recording device had captured his full confession, providing irrefutable evidence of his guilt in Rachel's murder and his attempted murder of me. The vials of poison found in the cabin, combined with Dr. Chen's toxicology analysis, proved the systematic nature of his crimes. Derek's accomplices, who turned out to be associates from his insurance company, who helped him identify potential victims and manipulate investigations, were arrested within hours. The scope of the conspiracy was larger than anyone had imagined, involving multiple people in a network dedicated to murdering spouses for insurance money. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Derek's crimes. In addition to Rachel and his attempt on me, evidence linked him to at least 3 other suspicious deaths in different states over the past decade. Sarah Miller, his high school girlfriend, came forward to testify about her own poisoning, providing crucial corroboration of Derek's long-standing pattern of violence. The trial became a media sensation, with Derek's calculated cruelty and the systematic nature of his crimes shocking even experienced prosecutors. The recorded confession from the cabin, combined with the mountain of evidence Maggie and I had gathered, made conviction inevitable. Derek showed no remorse throughout the proceedings, maintaining that his actions were justified and that his victims had brought their fates upon themselves. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before, returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The judge sentenced Derek to life in prison without the possibility of parole, calling his crimes a calculated campaign of terror against vulnerable women who had the misfortune to trust him. Derek's expression remained unchanged as the sentence was pronounced, as if the consequences were happening to someone else entirely. In the months that followed, I worked with authorities to identify other potential victims and helped establish a foundation in Rachel's memory dedicated to supporting women in dangerous relationships. Maggie became a close friend and surrogate, family member, our shared trauma and triumph creating a bond that transcended our original circumstances. The house Derek and I had shared was sold, with the proceeds donated to domestic violence prevention organizations. I moved to a different city, started fresh with my graphic design career, and slowly rebuilt my life around the truth, rather than the lies Derek had constructed. Sometimes people ask me how I found the courage to confront a serial killer, How I managed to outmaneuver someone with years of experience in murder and deception. The truth is that I had advantages Derek never anticipated. The love and support of someone who believed in me, the strength that comes from knowing the truth, and most importantly, the determination to ensure that evil actions have consequences. Derek thought he could eliminate me the same way he had eliminated Rachel, treating me as just another obstacle to be removed when convenient. But he underestimated the power of women who refuse to be victims, who stand together against predators, and who fight for justice no matter the personal cost. Rachel's death was finally avenged, and Derek's pattern of murder was permanently broken. In the end, the man who thought he was clever enough to kill with impunity discovered that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that some debts must eventually be paid in full. The divorce papers I had prepared but never needed to serve became a symbol of the freedom Derek had tried to steal from me. Instead of being his second victim, I became the instrument of his downfall, ensuring that his reign of terror finally came to an end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.